Greetings and welcome to today's forum. My name is Gloria Latson-Billings and I serve as the current president of the National Academy of Education. Many of us would agree that we are living in an era of unprecedented social and political polarization. Issues that in previous eras may have seemed common sense are politicized and fraught with tensions. Whether or not to believe and receive science, or to determine how policing should occur, or how to tell the history of the nation, all leave teachers and students in a quandary. Yet grappling with these tensions are exactly the charge of public schooling in a democratic society. The goal of this project is to better prepare students to examine and discuss complex civic, political, and social issues by ensuring that the curricula, pedagogy, and learning environments that they experience are informed by the best possible evidence and practice. This includes identifying opportunities to learn from established areas of interdisciplinary research on human learning and development, as well as current exemplars of instruction. I want to take a moment to thank the Hewlett Foundation for being the sponsor of this important work. And of course, I want to thank the steering committee, the panel members, the authors, and staff who have contributed to this work. This has involved a massive effort of over 60 individuals ranging from senior scholars working in these areas for decades to emerging scholars and researchers who brought new voices to this effort. I do want to acknowledge, however, that today on many campuses, there is a civic action in support of Abolition May and the movement to rethink campus policing. Our decision to proceed with this activity in no way minimizes the import of that effort. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Carol D. Lee. Carol serves as the chair of the steering committee and the report editor. She is a well-known and highly respected scholar in literacy and the learning sciences. She is a professor emerita from Northwestern University, and most exciting for me, she is the president-elect of the Academy. Carol, welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. We want to welcome all of you and are so excited that so many of you have joined for the launching of this report. Next slide. So as Gloria indicated, this report is an effort of a wide range of people from across multiple disciplines. We want to acknowledge our steering committee, who headed panels, interdisciplinary panels who work specifically on outlining the parameters of the report and worked in with the particular authors. You can see that this is a very illustrative and diverse body of scholars. Next slide. The question with which we wrestled was the question in the civic domain of what should we do? What should we do in terms of public policy practices in light of our democratic goals for the country? Next slide. We began thinking about this project after the 2016 election, in which there was so much divisiveness. And at an annual meeting of the Academy, I raised the question of how we as educators and particularly the Academy think about what it means to prepare our young people to engage in the complexities of civic participation in light of the challenges at that time. We could not have imagined at that time the challenges that would be emerging over the next 4 years. So as we have looked at and very much been informed and impressed by how, as a public, we wrestle with the mass shootings that have been so persistent. Certainly the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, the impact that the Black Lives Matter movement has had, looking at NAEP civic scores that have remained consistently low over the decades. Certainly the pandemic has posed tremendous problems for us to wrestle with in terms of personal decision-making as well as public policy, issues of climate change, looking at what's been happening in California and in other places around the country and the world, the fight that is still ongoing around election results, so much that is happening in terms of social media misuse and political polarization, that the question we're raising is, how do we prepare young people to wrestle with these complex issues? Next slide. This challenge that we have wrestled with, we think, is complicated very much by the nature of the American experiment, that we have developed a complex system of governance that in many respects is aimed at being sufficiently elastic as to support diverse points of view, diverse beliefs. These are complicated, for example, about relationships between federal and local decision-making, wrestling around majority versus minority rights. We see this coming up right now with debates in the public, for example, about wearing masks, who wears and under what conditions, and how do we think about the notion of inalienable rights of the individual. It's also complicated, this decision-making process, by the fact that we're a nation of immigrants and a nation with very contested history. Many of the debates that we're having around even civics education right now are around how do we wrestle with what many of us call the African Holocaust of enslavement, the fact that there were indigenous nations here and the war against those nations to establish what we call the United States. This very complex history we have both in the past and today around contestations over immigration policies, who should come, under what circumstances, et cetera. And a history of communities that sustain national as well as transnational identities makes this a very complex country in terms of managing how we are together and also how we are different, and how we wrestle with these things with an understanding that there are no simple histories of simple leaders who are good or bad. Next slide. So this report is fundamentally about how we can improve opportunities for students to learn how to engage in civic reasoning and discourse, looking at issues of pedagogy, curriculum, and learning environments, but filtered through what we know from the science of learning to inform, and we're going to try to address that in some detail in our presentations today. What this report is not about is particular political positions. We wrestled very hard to try to not promote any particular political position, but rather how do we support students in wrestling with difference. And we make a distinction between value orientations about what we would think of as democratic versus anti-democratic values. For example, this is why we address issues of morality in civic decision-making. We use as an example in the 2008 election when Senator John McClain was during the campaign, this woman was making these negative comments about Barack Obama, and he bent down and said, no, he's a good man. So that beyond the political positions in which they differed, that there was a impetus in terms of basic democratic values. We can argue over political orientations, but not over value orientations around democratic decision-making. Next slide. So we think that there are several unique contributions of this report. One of them is the fact that it's interdisciplinary in nature. We draw across multiple disciplines, have multiple areas of expertise informing. We have tried to conceptualize the nature of civic learning and discourse, drawing on the science of learning and human development across multiple disciplines. We make, as other reports obviously do, focusing on equitable access to rigorous learning, but focused largely on project-based inquiry-oriented approaches. And particularly, I think different is our emphasis on the fact that this work has to be accomplished and focused across the K-12 sector and across content areas, and have attempted to address issues of citizenship, which we will illustrate in one of our presentations on one of the chapters, the complexities of citizenship in this country. Next slide. So the next slide. So we have 8 some odd chapters. We list here the authors as well as the panel members who contributed to them. The point that I think I would like to make is the scope of the way we've tried to conceptualize the issue. One, starting off with saying that we have to examine the philosophical and moral foundations of civic decision-making. Second, that it is very important that any pedagogical curricular recommendations we make be rooted in what you understand about the science of human learning and development. Third, we've tried to place the challenges in a historical context, both in terms of how we have tried to address issues of civic education in terms of policy and practice within the country historically. Next slide. But also trying to understand differences in how communities within the United States have both conceptualized and addressed the challenges of citizenship. So we have specific focus in terms of indigenous populations, African-American, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander, and focus on an Appalachian community as one example in terms of predominantly white populations, although Appalachia is integrated. We also, in taking a larger view of this, are looking at structural factors both within the United States and across the world that impact how citizenship challenges unfold. Next slide. And then narrowing down to look at what are the implications for the organization of classrooms and schools, the issues about what the implications are for teachers in learning to address the complex issues we're raising, and the particular challenges that digital media present. So with that overview, I'd like to pass this on to Peter Levine, who will begin introducing the opening chapter of the volume, focusing on philosophical and moral foundations of civic reasoning and discourse.
Thanks so much, Carol, and thanks for all your leadership and inspiration and guidance throughout this. It's been very wonderful for me and educational for me to work with you. The paper I'm going to talk about quite quickly is actually written by Sarah Stitzline from University of Cincinnati. She was reflecting intense deliberations among our team, which included Tony Layden from University of Illinois, Chicago, Jennifer Morton from University of North Carolina, and me. And I think all those people are here today, so great to see everybody. I think our job was to provide the basic definitions of civic reasoning and some related ideas like citizenship and civility that would be important for the rest of the papers. And so we did that early and tried to share our emerging definitions with the other authors. And I would say we started here, that if you, a person, want to take responsibility for the world and make the world a better place, you need to ask the question, what should we do? What should we do? That's the civic question. And civic reasoning is the sort of reasoning we do as we answer that question. So what should we do is the question, and civic reasoning is what we do when we ask that question. The we in that sentence can be at any scale, from a pair of friends to a global religious community bigger than the nation state. The nation state, such as the United States, is one of those we's. But it's only one along a continuum. The question is, what should we do, not what should be done or what should somebody do? So there's a real focus on the agency of the people. And the word should in the question emphasizes the value dimension. So the conversation about what should we do is a conversation in part about what are the good means and what are the good ends that we should be pursuing as a group. At the same time, it's not just a value conversation. It's also about facts, about information. And so the formal definition in the report talks about thinking through public issues, using rigorous inquiry skills and methods, weighing different points of view, and examining available evidence. So that's what civic reasoning is for us. What about citizenship? For us, and I quote Sarah, citizenship means membership in any group in which you can ask this question. So you can be a citizen, a good citizen of your second grade classroom if you're part of asking what should we do. You can also be a not very good citizen of the United States, even if you happen to be born or naturalized here. So the form of citizenship we're talking about is not recognition by a government that you hold legal rights. It's participation in a group in which you are asking, what should we do? To do that well, you need certain values, virtues, and dispositions. And the ones that we talk about in the paper the most, or that Sarah Sitzland talks about the most, are empathy, a willingness to compromise, an eye on the possibility, as well as the pitfalls of consensus, a collaborative spirit, and civility. And we talk about each of those at some length, or at least we give a few paragraphs at least to each of them. I want to just mention civility because that's very much in the news and somewhat contested. And after saying a few words about civility, I'll hand it over. So following actually Tony Layden's work, we do not define civility in terms of politeness or following certain kinds of rules for appropriate speech or certain limits against inappropriate speech. Instead, we think of it in terms of responsiveness. So in the paper, we say civility is a form of engagement with others that relies on skills and dispositions of being open to and cooperating with diverse participants toward continued mutual engagement and a just dialogue. So being civil is keeping the conversation going. It affirms the dignity and humanity of one's interlocutors, even if it allows for questioning or critiquing their claims. Sometimes I would say, this is not a quote anymore, but sometimes I would say expressing outrage can actually be the best way to demonstrate civility, depending on the circumstance, if we think of civility as responsiveness. So those are the definitions we laid out, starting with the definition of civic reasoning, and I hope that people will see them run as a through line through the rest of the report. And with that, I want to turn things over to my colleague, Naila.
Great, wonderful. Okay, I think I clicked all the right buttons. It's great to be here with you this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to share, Carolee and I are going to share on the chapter that focuses on civic reasoning and discourse, perspectives from learning and human development, that really focuses on what do we know from the underpinnings of learning sciences and developmental research that help inform how we might approach the teaching and learning of civic reasoning and discourse. Next slide, please. So this chapter focuses on really one key question. What do the learning sciences and developmental research tell us about how we should be designing education for civic reasoning and discourse? Next slide. And so we really have two kind of overarching propositions. This is the first one. The first proposition is that preparation for and the practice of civic reasoning and discourse should happen throughout the lifespan and be incorporated across core academic disciplines across the K-12 sector. Next slide. And this, our work here is really rooted in a deep commitment to honoring what we know scientifically about how children and young people learn, which we draw on the How People Learn volumes 1 and 2. So from volume 1, we argue that learning is always built on prior knowledge. It is always social and emerging from interaction. It's differently organized for novices and experts, situated in specific contexts, mediated by artifacts and tools, and distributed across environment and time. Next slide. From How People Learn 2, we layer in, and the brain matters, right? And the most recent brain science suggests that when people feel a sense of connection and belonging, they learn better. When they are in stressful situations or feel a threat, that impedes processes of learning. And so all of that has implications for the kinds of learning environments that we set up, especially for content like thinking about civic reasoning and discourse. Next slide. And so there are some foundations in terms of what we know about early development that have implications for the development of civic discourse and reasoning, including the proclivity for imitation, cultural behavior norms, early rudimentary understandings of cause and effect, creation and destruction, ownership versus sharing, and what we learn about the narrative structure of stories, what we learn about gender, race, value, and we'll say more about this in a moment, but also the deep intuitive sensibilities young people have about morality and fairness. And all of those really weigh into some of the early underpinnings of what becomes civic reasoning and discourse. Next slide. And so we're going to talk about two of those kinds of developmental underpinnings today: identity development and moral development, both of which we argue form a base for the development of civic reasoning and discourse. And our efforts to support these capabilities then have to be informed by what we know about development in these areas. With respect to moral development, we know from the research that children form personal moral understandings from a very young age. We know that those moral understandings involve notions of harm or welfare, fairness or justice, and rights. We know that moral understandings shift over time from early childhood to adolescence, and that notions around fairness, rights, and social justice become better crystallized over time. And we know that even from a very young age, children can separate their own self-interest from universal moral judgments. Next slide. With respect to identity development, we know that identity development takes place over the life course, but is particularly salient in adolescence. We know that both general identity development and ethnic and racial identity are relevant to civic reasoning and discourse, and that they're complex, right? They involve notions of race, culture, immigrant status, language, social class, all matter for how one is positioned in the world and in schools, and for then how they are positioned to take up particular notions of civic reasoning and discourse. And that truly social and political issues often have at their core these issues of identity and belonging. So they're really important to consider when thinking about how to construct educational environments that are most productive. Next slide. Proposition 2, the skills of civic reasoning and discourse demand complex, cross-disciplinary, and well-practiced repertoires of inquiry, dialogue, sense-making, and problem-solving. And I think what you're hearing underneath all of this, and in the prior presentation, as well as Carol's introduction, is that this stuff is complicated and it's integrated. And so thinking about how we, this is not just a matter of what happens in one civics course in the 9th grade. Like, this is a matter of how we approach education across the disciplinary, across the disciplines and across developmental time. Next slide. And so then you think about what happens when you're developing civic reasoning. It involves a set of dispositions, right? A commitment to democratic principles, the willingness and proclivity to question, considering multiple points of view, listening to others, which are developed through both, epistemology, like the stuff we know and how we come to know it over time, knowledge, moral development, and this wrestling with identity, who one is in the world, and the kinds of commitments one has by virtue of culture and community. And so again, just these are processes that unfold in complex ways over time. Next slide. And they have implications for thinking about then how we organize learning within the core disciplines. And I'm not going to go very deeply into any of these, but I did want to note that the chapter takes up each of these disciplines: literacy, social studies, literature, math, and science, and thinks about a set of practices, which are in the boxes at the bottom, that you must draw on build prior knowledge, provide a sense of emotional safety, establish relevance through real world problems, build efficacy through scaffolded challenges, support the questioning of information sources, support the questioning of your own assumptions, wrestle with complex and contradictory ideas, and ensure a multiplicity of cultural and ideological perspectives. And that those processes must happen in every course across the disciplines over developmental time, to really provide the opportunity for people to practice and understand these ways of being intellectuals in the world. Next slide. So some specific implications for literature, thinking about what that might mean for how we attend to cultural diversity in literature texts, how we connect to students' everyday repertoires of language and meaning making. Next slide. in mathematics, how you think about mathematics not as just coming from one tradition, but the various ranges of mathematical traditions that connect to different communities across and over time, thinking about how we support the questioning of information sources, ensuring the multiplicity of cultural and ideological perspectives, and also this notion of real world relevance, how people think about math in connection to making sense of the world around them. Next slide. And then science, similarly, these ideas around epistemic and ontological heterogeneity, thinking about difference, and the various ways in which this slide also details some strategies folks have used to think about approaching science from a perspective that supports this questioning of assumptions, establishing real world relevance, and so on. Next slide. And there are some challenges, right? So, where there are issues of knowledge construction, conceptual change, implicit bias, institutional reinforcements that are all influenced by perceptions of self, others, settings, tasks, influenced by the types of supports people have to do this work and the various challenges their own in lives and communities that are happening. So again, part of what we're wanting to convey is the real complexity of doing this work. Next slide. And we also wanted to just give a quick nod to what happens in chapter 5, which focuses on structural inequality, migration, and conflict, which is to say that all of this that we've been talking about also happens in a global context and in a national context where young people and families and communities are having a range of experiences that have impact. Next slide. Including structural inequalities that shape and constrain the educative settings within which children learn to be citizens, including global migration, which profoundly shapes and reshapes families, communities, and schools, broadens young people's civic identities, and in some cases creates a citizenship gap that must be wrestled with, and the presence of violence, which is a consequence of and a contributor to the disruption of civic life and requires a repair of the very social fabric. Next slide. And finally, there's some ways people have thought about, given those global and national constraints and properties of the ecology, how then you would approach contextually informed educational approaches for diverse forms of participation. That includes critical curricular approaches, youth action initiatives, and arts-based approaches to developing kind of counter narratives. And I will end there and pass to Dr. Lee.
So we have tried to present a broad understanding of the dimensions of civic reasoning and discourse. Next slide. As involving knowledge, epistemological orientations in terms of value and complexity, the ways in which, as Nyla described, how our thinking is fundamentally shaped by emotional response and emotional attributions we make to experiences we have in the world, as Peter described, filtered again through ethics or kind of moral criteria that we use for making judgments and perceptions. And that this process or these dimensions of civic reasoning again involve some fundamental issues around wrestling with implicit bias, wrestling with conceptual change, that is, new things we have to learn that may stand in contradiction to things we think that we know. Next slide. So as Naila had made some discussion of examples in the core areas of how civic reasoning, supportive civic reasoning would come into play, we've simply tried here to just outline some subject areas in which there's complex relationships between these dispositions that we've talked about, but also fundamental issues of knowledge. So the COVID data displays that we see every day, the kind of probabilistic reasoning that's entailed in that work. In science, understanding COVID mutations and issues around climate change. History, understanding there are issues coming up today around the Electoral College, but having some understanding of the foundations of the Electoral College, how it came into being, issues around the Senate filibuster. The point being in all of these is that there is a knowledge dimension in addition to the ethical and moral dimensions that we spoke about. Next slide. So this is just one example of content knowledge impacting how we think about the COVID pandemic that we're wrestling with right now. From this information, which is available in the public, understanding viral mutations and why they are important, as content knowledge is important, understanding implications and how mutations might impact the efficacy of vaccinations and what it means for how many people need to be vaccinated, understanding complex data displays, and then how this knowledge then we would use in terms of making decisions both at the federal, state, and local context, just as an example of the complexity, the knowledge dimensions. Next slide. Here we try to present an example of the challenges taken up, interestingly, in recent history around issues of gun violence. So after the horrible shooting at the Parkland High School, and students, young people began to organize around issues of gun violence and had this beautiful march in Washington, D.C. But the issue in terms of complexity is understanding and looking at the competing conceptions of what the problem was to begin with. Some people viewing it as just as something requiring a procedural set of remedies around access to guns. Some people conceptualizing this as a problem of public health. Others looking at state-sanctioned violence, and that even among the young students themselves, there were competing points of view. Diana Hess's research, which she may speak about in her presentation, about how difficult it is for schools to take up these issues where there are very different points of view by both the young people and their families as well. Next slide. So in this particular context, just in terms of history, the complex kind of knowledge around history of the Second Amendment, political issues, data displays, sociology, etc. But there's a wide range of content knowledge, if you will, that's necessary to wrestle with this complex problem. Next slide. So they were arguing that civic reasoning actually involves a form of argumentation, where in many cases, what we end up really arguing about are the warrants, that is the beliefs, systems that we believe should be used so that others will believe the claims that we make. Next slide. So then we're looking at the question of what does this mean for civic discourse? We've talked a lot about civic reasoning, but in terms of civic discourse, the civic discourse does involve, as we said, the dispositions around commitment to democratic principles, being disposed to raise questions, to consider multiple points of view, to listen to others, and it is developed through these dispositions and knowledge base that we've talked about. Next slide. But what students need to internalize, we think, around issues of discourse is both civility, as Peter discussed it, and that is informed, again, we would argue, by science of learning in terms of the salience of emotions. If we don't feel safe in discussions about difference, then we're not going to be able to listen to one another. But also understanding rhetoric and the ways in which civic actors will often overgeneralize, will demonize the other, will manipulate or obfuscate their points of view or misrepresent opposing positions. And our point here is that students need to learn how to examine the rhetoric that they hear in the public around complex civic issues. Next slide. So we're just going to close out with just a summary of the lessons we think that we have learned from what we tried to do in this chapter, where we're fundamentally arguing that there is a base in the science of human learning and development to inform how we think about learning these complex demands of civic reasoning. So again, as we've indicated, issues of conceptual change, studies of implicit bias, moral reasoning, epistemological dimensions, what it means to learn to empathize with others, even when we disagree, to anticipate the social and emotional demands of engaging in this kind of work, access to sufficient data to make claims and support with evidence, the development of metalinguistic knowledge about how rhetoric may be used to try to convince us. Next slide. That again, that learning is a complex endeavor. It involves sense making across the disciplines, that it develops across the life course, and that issues around how we teach, how we help make knowledge in the disciplines relevant becomes very important in terms of learning how to engage in this work, and that it's not localized, it's ecological. There are many broad ecological contexts that are influencing. Next slide. So I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip that slide and just close with the specific recommendations that we are making for teaching across the disciplines, to draw and build on students' prior knowledge, to promote a sense of emotional safety, establish relevance through engagement with real world problems, provide opportunities for personal collective efficacy in doing this work, teaching students to question sources of information, to interrogate their own assumptions, to wrestle with complexity, and to ensure access to a multiplicity and variety of cultural and ideological perspectives. So in closing, our overarching takeaway, we think, is that there is a role in public education across the K-12 sector, across all disciplines, to prepare our young people to engage with the very complex challenges that we're dealing with today, and that it is the work in history and social studies is essential, but it is not the only place where we need to be doing this work. With that, I will pass that on to Jim Anderson, who will address the history dimensions of doing this work.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jim.
Okay, thank you. As part of the report, there's a short history of debates over civic education and civic reasoning throughout of American history, which is written by Nancy Beatty and Zoe Burkholder. It's a wonderful history of debates over civic education and some of the issues that have zigzagged across American history from the colonial period to the present. There are a number of things that they deal with in the report, and I will concentrate on a few. They point out that civic education is itself political, and we've always been embroiled in politics around civic education, as we are today. We have everything from congressional, from senators or congresspersons asking the Secretary of Education to ban any references or use of the 1619 project. We also have efforts from the presidential administration to impose a 1776 project. And we also have a conservative caucus that wants to reinscribe traditions of Anglo-Saxonism. So these things are some of the things that have been debated throughout our history, and they're taken up in the report. And one of the things they point out is that the legacies of injustices actually undermine our capacity to support civic education. And we can see that in the debates that we're having now, as opposed to some platform where teachers are able to be reasonable, objective, and very rational about civic education and what it's mean historically and what it means to present. There are all these political forces bearing down on them that makes it very difficult. And the short history deals with this over time, reminding us that this is nothing new and that we've always had difficulty with civic discourse and civic reasoning when it comes to our legacies of injustice. Another thing this report does is emphasize the importance of the use of history as central to civic education. And they discuss history as a form of civic reasoning, history as confronting legacies of the past. And when I think about an example, there's a wonderful historical analysis or book by Reginald Horsman, and the title is Race and Manifest Destiny, The Origins of American Racial Anglo-Saxonism. Well, it's this kind of history and this kind of scholarship that comes to bear when we see political efforts in civic discourse around reinscribing this particular tradition, to remind us that there's a historical context for understanding these questions, these issues that have been with us for a very long time, and that we should not abstract civic discourse and civic reasoning from the historical context. They also remind us that history has a repertoire of evidence and examples that we can use in civic education. And then understanding of the historical understanding and the cultivation of agency to see how through civic education and in different communities, it has been the basis of cultivating agencies. As part of the report, it's expanded by several rich and important reports on how civic education is viewed from the angle of visions of various communities in America. And so there is a chapter on indigenous peoples and civic education in the 21st century. There's one on African American education as preparation for civic engagement, reasoning and discourse. There's another chapter on historicizing Latinx civic agency and contemporary lived civics. A fourth chapter on Asian American exclusion and the fight for inclusion, which is a wonderful chapter, particularly given what's going on in America today, with a astonishing rise in Asian American racism, anti-Asian American racism, as well as the hate and violence that we're witnessing. And so it's good to look at this from a historical standpoint and get a sense of this exclusion throughout of American history. There's also a chapter on Appalachia called Appalachia Spring, Hope and Resiliencies Among Youth in the Rural South, and looking at issues of class and poverty as well, and what it means for the teaching of civic education. And so these chapters together really remind us that, one, civic education has been debated throughout of American history, and that we should contextualize from a historical standpoint the meaning and the debates of civic education in American history. I would close by saying these are really rich and wonderful chapters. I learned a lot, and I think you will as well. So at this point, I will turn to Dr. Diana Hess.
Good afternoon. I'm going to describe the main ideas in the chapters written by two panels. One that focuses on learning environments, which was chaired by Judith Torney-Purda and co-written by Carolyn Barber, Chris Clark, and Judith, and another that focuses on pedagogical practices and how teachers learn, which I chaired, and Hillary Conklin was the lead writer. In terms of learning environments, the chapter argues that civic reasoning and discourse is best developed in classrooms with open classroom climates in which students are engaged in discussions and deliberations of authentic political and social issues. An open classroom climate is marked by students who feel comfortable presenting their own views and have opportunities to listen, learn from, and engage with peers with different views. Teachers play a key role in creating an open classroom climate by helping students develop strong and respectful relationships with one another and fostering norms of respectful discourse. Teachers can also serve as role models by ensuring that instructional materials and discussions are relevant and meaningful to students' lived experiences. The respect for personal experience by recognizing that the particular set of social contexts each student inhabits and the associated experiences with them are incredibly important in terms of developing the kind of climate in which civic reasoning and discourse can develop and thrive. Development of collective and self and collective efficacy is a major focus of the chapter. Through engaging in civil discourse in open, supportive, and challenging school and classroom climates, students develop confidence in their own ability to engage with civic issues that they then take with them outside of the learning environment. Moreover, opportunities for engagement with teachers and other groups of peers has been found to foster a sense of collective efficacy. This is particularly evident when students have experiences of working with a group to affect change in their community or in their school. Opportunities to move from discourse to action was focused on in this chapter as well. In many cases, the presentation of authentic problems in a learning environment presents opportunities for students to engage in social action as students look to implement changes that are discussed relevant to their school or community. Student leadership opportunities, youth participatory action research projects, and youth organizing are all examples of activities that can be implemented in learning environments to encourage meaningful and active involvement within supported and developmentally appropriate structures. In terms of the chapter on pedagogical practices and how teachers learn, the authors argue that the importance of civic curriculum across fields and subjects, not only in social studies courses in which civic education has traditionally been centered, is going to be key moving forward. Curriculum should include authentic controversies for students to investigate and deliberate. Curriculum should highlight the complexity of democratic ideals. It should reflect our pluralistic democracy, and it should use the lived experiences of youth and showcase examples in which individual and collective agency resulted in change. Civic instruction should engage young people in carefully planned and varied forms of civic reasoning and discourse, with a particular attention to the role of social inequalities in classroom civil discourse. Teachers are incredibly important, and this chapter recommends that their initial preparation and continuing professional development should ensure a deep understanding of socio-political and contextual factors. It should explicitly encourage teachers to include challenging, controversial, and difficult topics, and it should help teachers build skills to implement civic reasoning and discourse pedagogies. School administrators are especially key. They can help create a school in which open classroom climates are the norm. They can support teachers in their practice by explaining to parents and to the public why civic reasoning and discourse is so important for students to develop. And they can ensure that teachers receive the professional development they need. I want to commend the authors of these two chapters. I think they're both excellent chapters. They're incredibly comprehensive. They're well written, and they include lots of recommendations for research, policy, and practice. And now I would like to turn to my colleague, Professor Joe Kahne.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks everybody for this opportunity. The thoughts I'll share draw on a chapter written with Antero Garcia, Sarah McGrew, Nicole Mira, and Brendisha Times. And since time is tight, I'll start with our main point. Mainstream efforts to promote what's often called digital citizenship have value, but they need to be broadened to address the civic and political context in which challenges such as racism and partisan division often make it difficult to achieve the kind of discourse and reasoning that we need with a healthy democracy. In what follows, I'll share a bit about what we think this rethinking or broadening might involve. In mapping this terrain of education related to digital citizenship, we identified 3 domains, and most of the work in schools centers on the first 2, on civility and on information analysis. But in addition to these priorities, which reflect challenges posed by the digital age, the digital sphere also has some desirable affordances. Digital engagement has, of course, transformed youth social action. Youth voice and engagement have long have played key roles in important social movements, from Black Lives Matter to the climate movement. There's a long list. So if we care about youth agency, and we argue in the chapter, of course, that we should, we believe educators also need to focus on ways to support youth voice and engagement, as well as focusing on civility and information analysis. So one of the broadenings of our focus on digital citizenship should be to ensure attention within schools on promoting youth civic voice. Now, there have been studies of all 3 sets of practices, and the good news from our review of the literature is that the studies show some benefits. We can get a reduction in online bullying, youth become better at judging the credibility of online content, and youth become more active during non-school time using digital media to express their civic voice. So given these benefits, we think it's vital to ensure that these learning opportunities are equitably distributed. At the same time, one of our findings is that many of the approaches to educating about these issues do not address structural dynamics. And we think that they need to address structural dynamics if they're to achieve their full potential. I'll start with the civility domain. Incivility is, of course, not just about kids not knowing how to interact respectfully. Incivility related to politics is often structured by disrespect and partisan identities, and it often employs sexism and racism, homophobia. Consider, for example, a study recently completed by Devin English and colleagues, including our co-author Brindisha Tynes. They found that Black adolescents are exposed online to racial discrimination on average about 15 times a week. Thus, it may be an individual youth who makes a homophobic or a racist or a sexist comment, but that youth didn't invent the genre, right? The practice reflects deeply problematic and deeply embedded norms and scripts. So our media literacy education must surface and examine these deeply embedded norms and beliefs and practices if we're to make progress. Or let's consider misinformation. Misinformation may be circulated by individuals, but its substance is most often created by organizations and institutions, by political parties, by governments, by business groups, by prominent politicians. And the generation of this inaccurate content is not simply because people made a mistake, rather it's part of a strategy. And the strategy works not just because people lack skills to check facts, because due to partisan identities and other identities, beliefs, or interests, individuals are predisposed to agree with falsehoods. Research shows, for example, that judgments of the accuracy of politically oriented posts, those judgments about a political issue, are impacted more by whether the post aligns with an individual's beliefs than about whether the actual post is accurate or not. Consider, and Dion, if you could move to the next slide. Consider this, this headline from the Washington Post. For Republicans, fealty to Trump's election falsehood becomes a defining loyalty test. In other words, it isn't just that online or TV falsehoods lead some individuals to be misinformed. It's that loyalties to particular identities require rejection of the truth. So education or search skills can help, but they're unlikely to solve the whole problem. Media literacy education also needs to help students develop identities that value accuracy, identities that value empathy. And we need approaches that support a kind of metacognitive awareness of how our biases and varied identities operate. And finally, Jan, if you could move to the last slide. I guess I would close by saying this. Discourse and reasoning is going on, and it's going on online, but it's often practiced in ways that promote very problematic outcomes from the standpoint of a healthy democracy. Deep psychological, historical, and sociological dynamics are at work. We need research and practice that helps youth understand and respond productively to these psychological, historical, and sociological dynamics. Research into how to do this and how to do this at scale. And of course, if it's going to help our democracy, it has to be done at scale. That kind of work is really only just beginning, but it needs attention. And it's also worth underscoring that it will take courage and tremendous thoughtfulness for teachers to advance these practices in many educational contexts where they're likely to encounter resistance both from students and perhaps especially from parents. And indeed, we're seeing that play out in schools today. So educational research and educational leaders need to think about how to support teachers. In short, we believe that educational efforts can help improve digital forms of civic and political engagement. And as recent events make clear, the stakes are high. Thank you again, and now I'll pass it over to Carol Lee.
So I'm going to close very quickly before we go on to our moderators to highlight the recommendations that are coming out of the report. We encourage you all to read the report. It's a very long document. And we have an extensive set of recommendations, but we're going to try to summarize the 5 big key highlights for the report. Next slide. Next slide. So the first recommendation is that learning the complex demands of civic reasoning and discourse should be grounded in research on how learning entails students' identity development, cognitive development, as well as moral and ethical development. And we think that one of the unique contributions of this report is the specific focus on what we can learn from the synthesis of science of learning and human development to inform how we think about the challenges of young people learning to engage in this kind of work. Next slide. That civic learning should occur in environments that are conducive to student discussion, utilize project-based and inquiry-oriented approaches, and provide opportunities for developmentally responsive democratic decision-making. All students should have access to these kinds of learning opportunities and approaches. And again, we're not saying project-based and inquiry-oriented for the heck of it because it's the cool thing to say, but rather that what we know about how children and adolescents learn, particularly complex, multifaceted kinds of knowledge and disposition, requires active engagement, not simply being told. Next slide. That civic education should not be siloed in civics classes, that all the core subject areas, as we've tried to demonstrate, should contribute to the range of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that students need to develop to investigate problems that emerge in the public domain. And we think this is also a second big contribution of this report. Next slide. That learning to engage in civic reasoning and discourse should explicitly include strategies to help students gather, analyze, and thoughtfully circulate information in the digital and other media, including identifying and combating misinformation. Next slide. And finally, the research infrastructures and other collaborative partnerships should be developed to generate up-to-date data on teaching and learning in the area of civic reasoning and discourse. So for example, the only sort of public access that we have to having a sense of how our students, what our students understand is through the NAEP civics assessments, which can persistently show very low levels of knowledge. But we tried to argue in this report that there's a greater array of kinds of knowledge and dispositions that we need to have a sense of, and we don't have data on that. To encourage the uptake of a K-12 focus across curriculum areas that facilitates this multidimensional understanding of the complexities of learning to engage in civic reasoning and discourse. And in our next steps, we will try to share at least how we're thinking about influencing the uptake across the curriculum. Next slide. So our next steps involve hosting a series of webinars. This is simply our first launch. The ones that follow, we anticipate will be with key stakeholder communities. So there are a number of organizations who have put together and released very powerful reports in this area. And we would like to gather with those organizations and stakeholders to initiate a set of conversations about the broader demands of dealing with this challenge. We want to pull together practitioner organizations that are working in the content areas of literacy, mathematics, science, history, social studies, and the arts, because these are organizations that are working, that are practitioner-led, and that play important leadership roles in terms of what unfolds in classrooms and kinds of supports for teachers. With research organizations focused on education and youth development, because we think there are many research implications for this work, with educational policymakers and leaders at the federal, state, and district levels as well as with the assessment community. We're also planning to design additional outreach to media outlets and hoping to spark more public discussion of these issues. And then we are planning to develop some shorter and more practice-oriented products that will be easily accessible for stakeholders. So next slide. So we thank you for this. You can find the full report at naededucation.org.
This is Greg White. I'm the Executive Director for the National Academy of Education. So thank you, Carol, and thank you to this morning's panelists and the over 60 panelists and authors who have contributed to this effort. Now that we have had a chance to learn more about the volume in this morning's overview, we want to transition into the second hour, which will feature a discussion of the report moderated by David Kerp and with guests Kathleen Hall-Jamieson and Rajiv Vinakota. And also we will have time for some question and answers. So please, in the Q&A box, if you could be adding those questions, we will be sure to share those with David as he moderates the session. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, David Kerp. A little bit about David. He is a professor of public policy at University of California, Berkeley, where he received the university's coveted Outstanding Teacher Award, a regular contributor to the New York Times and the Washington Post, where he writes about higher education. He is the author of 17 books, including The College Dropout Scandal, many of them award winners. Additionally, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the National Academy of Education. David has also advised governments in the US and abroad, and he has served on the President Obama and President Biden's education policy teams during the 2008 and 2020 transitions. So it is our great pleasure and honor to introduce you to David Kerp.
Greg, that was a very generous introduction. And Carol, that was a brilliant summary of the report. I can't think of three people better qualified to talk about these issues than Carol and Kathleen Hall-Jamieson and Rajiv Vinakota. Let me introduce them. I could spend an hour doing that, but I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version. Kathleen is a professor and former dean at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communication and the director of the university's Annenberg Public Policy Center. She is the author or co-author of 16 books, most recently Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President. Her work makes a hash of disciplinary boundaries. She's a fellow at the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the International Communications Association, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Throughout her distinguished career, her work is focused on understanding and improving democracy. In a recent Zoom discussion, she celebrated the elements of the United States government that came through, the courts that did their job amid the crises perpetrated during and after the last election. In her book, Students Come First, she has won university-wide teaching awards at each of the 3 universities at which she has taught, and of particular relevance to this forum. She directs the Sunnylands Constitutional Project, which has produced more than 30 films on the Constitution for high school students. Rajiv brings a different and equally valuable perspective to the conversation. He is a social entrepreneur and a nonprofit leader whose work is focused on educating, empowering, and supporting America's youth, especially those from disadvantaged communities. Early in his career, he co-founded the SEED Foundation, whose mission is to make sure that a child's zip code doesn't determine her future. SEED is the nation's only network of public college preparatory boarding schools designed for students who need and deserve a 24-hour learning environment to achieve their full potential. At the Aspen Institute, Rajiv launched a venture focusing on youth leadership development and civic engagement. And currently he is the president of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, which is committed to strengthening American education and rebuilding a flourishing society. So we will hear from our 2 distinguished commentators and then have a conversation among them and the people who have presented this report. So, Kathleen.
This paradigm shifting report is offering us a new vocabulary through which to see civics education. And in the process, it is going to offer the nation a really heavy lift, because although language does our thinking for us, we've inherited a vocabulary that fundamentally doesn't see the world the way in which this report does. So the important underlying distinctions that it is making, that we should work aggressively to try to communicate, because they're carrying new meaning, not the meaning ordinarily attached to this language, include civic reasoning and discourse. And what is important here is the linkage between the two, because this is civic reasoning and discourse, not civic reasoning, period, civic discourse. In the process of creating that linkage, we are presupposing that the reasoning process and the discourse process have an interrelationship and responsibilities attendant on both. I wonder whether we want to say discourse, by the way, instead of dialogue, as we try to legitimize this as an alternative frame of reference as we discuss this important topic. Then secondly, we have the notion that there is a climate conducive to it. So the notion that there is a climate asks us climate where, climate within the schools, within the educational process, but the conception here is far broader. Part of this conceptual shift moves us from the idea that this is the responsibility of a course to the notion that it should be a responsibility across the curriculum. And it moves responsibility not simply across the curriculum, but across the lifespan of individuals in education, and then across their lifespan as individuals, because it has what I see as two overarching and very important and daringly aspiring goals. The first is increasing the likelihood that the educated citizenry, that is those who come through our schools, have well-practiced repertoires of inquiry, dialogue, sense-making, and problem solving. I see two elements of that. First, they have to have the repertoire. How are they going to gain it across the curriculum? And they're going to have to be able to practice it. That's a new model of learning. Also, that they're going to develop the disposition to engage in civic reasoning and discourse in constructive fashions, because we're going to be tying moral and identity development into that process integrally. So if those are the goals, and we have a paradigm shift about where they're going to be situated within our understanding of the educational process, then we have to add additional concepts that are also not being traditionally defined. Citizenship is now being defined differently than we ordinarily would define it, as is civility. Both alternative sets of definitions are provocative, original, important, but different from ordinary language usage. And I particularly like the notion that this report is making warranting an important process in our understanding of how this happened. Too often, we teach a world through a model in which there's data, sometimes called evidence, and there's claim making, sometimes called conclusion, but we don't look at the process by which the evidence, the fact structure, gets to the claim making through values. And in the process of recentering warranting inside this discussion, this report has very importantly reminded us that part of this schooling process is a process of inculcating an understanding of a warranting that is profoundly moral and ethical. The break then first that this report offers is a vocabulary break. And if we will adopt this alternative vocabulary, there's an alternative way of seeing education and of acting differently as we think about our participation as this newly constructed notion of citizen in the groups that we are in, as well as all the other citizenship areas in which we engage. All of this, however, raises the possibility that if schools do this well across the curriculum and across the time that we have students in an educational structure, a formal educational structure, they may become practiced in a repertoire and also have models of that kind of constructive engagement that they can use to answer two other challenging questions. What's going to happen to them when they confront a world in which none of that is being modeled well anywhere? And will they be resilient enough and have enough agency to find ways to transform that world in which we do not have civic reasoning and dialogue as part of our model of public life? If they are able to do that, as they construct, as they confront deeply embedded norms and scripts that are counter to the ideals in this model, they, if we can do this well, will provide the small cohort that will ultimately act as a counterbalance to the norms and scripts that are now so destructive in our democracy. I love this report. I think it is paradigm shifting. It is facing major challenges because there's very little in the public life that most of us engage in now that is modeling the kinds of activities and engagement that are envisioned here.
Rajiv, over to you.
Thank you, David. And Kathleen, thank you for all of your commentary, which is incredible. And it's tough to follow up a superstar, but I will try. And as David said, I'm going to be wearing two hats here. In 2019, I developed a white paper after talking to many people, including many of the folks who are on this conversation, around this broader concept of civic learning that goes beyond the tendency to think of civics education and citizen development as purely or solely the responsibility of the civics or government class that one takes in high school, and that over indexes on civic knowledge development. And the need to develop a field that is one that has a shared identity, a strong research base, communities and standards of practice, grassroots supports, and funding streams that actually support all of these, all of the work that we're talking about today. My work in that white paper also pointed to the severe undercapitalization of this space and the need to focus investments similar to that happening in math, ELA, and the STEM disciplines, if not more, if we are to actually make a dent in achieving the laudable goals that are set out today. I'm also a social entrepreneur, as David said. And so part of the way I'll come at this is to say, how can this be used? I'll do that both as a school founder and as a field builder for civic learning. Let me start off with just two general comments in terms of the way in which I reacted to the paper. I first appreciated the breadth of the approach. That is exactly what we need. We don't need to oversimplify. We actually need to acknowledge the complexity that's here and that requires a multifaceted approach. So I am very thankful for that way in which this was all set out. Secondly, just as a molecular biologist by training, I appreciated the foundation in the sciences and brain development so that we could make sure that we're aligning with everything that we're learning about how young people learn. So my commentary in terms of this work. The first is that all of this, and I think that this echoes what Kathleen laid out, will be incredibly important to building a narrative that centers the type of citizen development that should be at the core of education and youth development. This narrative change is not only important for how we approach the work, but also for generating the kind of grassroots support and policy changes that are necessary over time to support all that's happening. And so language, to Kathleen's point, will be incredibly important, and also determining how to translate this language into something that's accessible for parents, for teachers, for policymakers will also be a very important step in this process. So even with all this complexity, it'll be important to then take all of this research and translate all of these conditions that have been laid out into a set of priorities. What can we start quickly? Which ones will take more time? How important is sequence? As the pedagogical practices chapter highlights, we're asking for professional, personal, and cultural changes in schools. We know those take an immense amount of focus and time, and we have to try to understand how to do that so that the adults have to be comfortable with this change and frankly own the process. And then, even if we're successful with that change, to the point that Kathleen just made, are we preparing the young people who are going through our systems for an adult world that doesn't actually look like the schools and the culture that we're building? So we need to change culture, and then we also need to prepare our young people to be aware and ready for a culture that will look different once they step outside of our communities. The second major practical question around the complexities and priorities is around measurement. Measurement's critical. It allows us to learn what is working, why it's working or not, and for whom it's working. It allows us to constantly learn. And as an operator, I needed to know what was working so I could set priorities and be able to change and make modifications where necessary. And so we talk about assessment, and this report talks about assessment near the end in terms of some of the next steps. But as an operator, one of the things that I would ask is, please help us create the assessments alongside this and even help prioritize that within all the things that are being done. We know that not all measurement or assessment is created equal, and so you'll need to help us on that as well. Where should we be looking? What assessment should we be utilizing first? And then how do we connect that and coordinate that at the policy level? because policymakers will quickly start to focus on that. What are we assessing? What will work? What's not working? What accountability can we put alongside this? And we'll have to have a narrative that speaks to the policymakers alongside all of this work and research that is going on. My final point is to make sure to leverage partnerships beyond schools and to make sure that we also implement some of this in parallel to schools. I appreciate, as was set out in the opening chapters, that schools are a democratizing element and that they're needed to be at the center of their work. But they're also incredibly complex structures with multiple demands on the institution's time and on the people who operate within those constructs. The question I ask is, are there ways to work in parallel so that we can leverage other channels, community organizations, institutions in the community, such as libraries, museums, after-school programming, early childhood institutions, families and parents, higher education, business, so that they can come in and work alongside schools to help with some of the implementation and adaptation of these practices. This is not an either-or situation, but how implementation can happen in support of what we need to do across society. To ask schools to take this on just alone is not fair to the educators, to those institutions. How we think about this in a comprehensive manner will probably increase the probability of success. And what we've learned from the work that we've done at Citizens and Scholars is that we can actually address some of the equity issues in working directly within communities and empowering and providing agency for young people to work directly there and to be able to develop their skills and their dispositions. The last point I will just raise as we think about schools is the question of the increasing geographic sorting in this country. I wonder, don't have an answer to this, but I wonder how much this sorting is also decreasing the type of varied viewpoints that we want to have in the classrooms, young people and adults engaging across different points of view and perspectives. As we have more and more sorting, I wonder if we have to be more and more explicit about how we work across communities to try to get those varied viewpoints that we may not be getting when we have just individual institutions and individual communities. Thanks so much. A spectacular amount of work that's done here. And I look forward to the continuing conversation.
Let me pick up the continuing conversation. And I will say that as I read the report and listened to the commentary, I found myself nodding vigorously in agreement. It resonates with messages that I was trying to impart to Berkeley students in the spring, teaching a class that used to be called Ethics in the Age of Trump. And this year I had to find a title in October. It's called Ethics in a Cataclysmic Age, which I told the students is a semester-long civics lesson and doing the very kinds of things that we would hope students would do. So I'm a public policy guy looking for solutions in the way that Rajiv is raising. I'm a critical friend of the enterprise, and I would describe myself as a hopeful skeptic. So I want to pose a couple of questions today, and we have not much time because I want to make sure the audience has a chance to participate. But first question is this: how do you make civic education of the ambitious kind that this report calls for successful in a world in which trust in government, trust in institutions is at an all-time low? I spent a good deal of time in Finland, which is where my husband is from. And there, if you ask the populace, as they did, do you support the president? Do you support the prime minister? In both cases, 90% said yes. In this country, 53% support President Biden. And the opposition is fierce. Now, in the 1920s, University of Chicago professor wrote a book called Dare the Schools Change the Social Order. And I wonder whether he got it backwards. The question might be, can the social order change the schools? How can civics education effectively push back? So that's the first part of a two-part question, and I'm compressing these in the interest of time. So that's about the context. The second question has to do with the students themselves. When I read the data on the students on this generation and think about how these students have grown up, what the world is they've grown up in, and how different it is from the world that any of us who are sitting here in this room grew up in. the worlds. It's been, turmoil and turbulence and financial calamity and pandemic and political upheaval. So what's the result? If you look at the data, the students really are bifurcated. They are profoundly alienated from the political system, and they are also more activist than any other generation recently. If you look at the figures, 35% of all students and 45% of African-American students say that they are actively engaged in politics. How do you take advantage of that? So how do you address the context problem? How do you bring the students into a world in which it's the activism and not the skepticism and the alienation that predominate? The questions are really for Kathleen and Rajiv, and I hope you guys talk with each other, and to Carol as well. And if the other panelists want to join in, that's great.
Let me respond in the particular. I think we mine our history for examples in which individual agency persisting across time, acting in the interests of others, has affected institutional change. So you demonstrate in the process that what an individual can do through the kinds of civic reasoning and discourse that are being offered throughout this curricular structure would be the kinds of things that Lilly Ledbetter did when she had no advantage whatsoever and personal advantage in continuing to try to change the law. The court had held the law was specific, the statute was governing, she was not going to get the pay that she was entitled to, she'd been discriminated against. She continued to agitate to make the system change for others. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, dissenting on the court when the court rules against Ledbetter, calls on Congress to change the law. The law is changed. It's the first thing that President Obama signs. Lilly Ledbetter changed the law for other women. Across that narrative, what one is doing is recovering a system that is capable of working when an individual acts through agency to make it happen. Korematsu is a second example. Japanese internment is a blot on the conscience of the United States. It was a grave injustice. The court upheld it. It was considered to be good law. That is, even after the fact, even after history's judgment had expressed outrage that had occurred inside this system, Korematsu persisted in uncovering, with the help of journalists, all of the evidence to suggest that the evidence underlying that court case had been bad. People had lied. Korematsu persists into old age, and Korematsu ultimately is given a medal by Congress. He is recognized by President Clinton. And finally, John Roberts says just a number of years ago, that is not good law. Korematsu righted a wrong in the way in which he engaged in kinds of agency, gathering evidence, making arguments, and persisting across time, not because that injustice was present, it was in the past, but so that it would never happen again. It's in those kinds of historical reconstructions that I think we are capable of inculcating a disposition to engage in civic reasoning and discourse with as its end systemic change inside our systems of government, and that can be a means of restoring confidence, bringing the engagement in from the part of your second question into the institutions that are part of your first question in ways that increase the capacity to trust.
If I could just add, Kathleen, I agree 100%. And I would suggest that the chapter that we developed on resilience among ethnic minority communities in the United States was a very intentional decision on our part to illustrate exactly what you're talking about, so that I think the lessons about the possibility of individual agency and community organized agency sits inside of understanding the issues I tried to address early on about the elasticity that is built into our system of governance that provides a pathway for precisely the kinds of resistance that you're talking about. And so it's important that our students understand those pathways on the one hand, but also, and that they understand those histories of resistance and resilience. And I think that invoking history becomes very important, that while we feel very overwhelmed with the multiplicity of challenges that we're dealing with right now, this is not new. You can go back to virtually every epoch in the history of the United States, and there are going to be these periods of intense societal and international challenge. And it is often in the midst of those, going back to, I believe, Rajiv had talked about, that it is often in the midst of those intense challenges that the opportunities for change and for courage and resilience emerge, sometimes more intensely than in periods where we perceive there's less challenge. So what we tried to do in that chapter was to show how in each one of these communities that have faced persistent intergenerational structural challenges have engaged internally with developing young people with the capacities to understand the structures with which they were wrestling and to also understand their power to resist and to develop structures within communities. So I would suggest looking at that chapter as one illustration of the point that I think both you and Rajiv are making.
Rajiv?
David, just to pile on, I think the core idea here is one about agency. Simply put, developing agency in young people and having them see the changes that they can develop, they can make happen, even if it's at a local community level, starts to have kind of a flywheel effect, right? And so you don't have to think about, though we had great examples that Kathleen brought up, you don't have to think about trying to change the direction of the nation immediately. But if young people can engage and get a sense of agency that they have an impact, that builds their trust in the system. You start to have a virtuous cycle.
So just a word about that, and my role is to be the provocateur. You know, these are the questions I think other people will answer. So let me just respond briefly to what you said, and then ask one final question. Kathleen's examples are great, but they don't happen in the schools, and I think it's important that they don't happen, that they're outside the schools, because if you look at the schools, it really is the case that the only changes that stick for a long time are structural changes, not policy changes. You know, with the exception of Brown versus Board of Education, which really arises in the context of the Soviet Union damning the US for its racial discrimination, and STEM, which only arises as an issue because of American competitiveness in the world and the need to produce trained workers, knowledge workers, as Bob Reich would say. How you get civics education the attention that it deserves in the context of our times is the key question, I think. And as I said initially, I'm a supporter of this. Everything that the report includes and everything that I've heard makes entire sense. But I go back to James Carville advising Bill Clinton in his 1992 campaign. Remember the phrase KISS? Keep it simple, stupid? Well, you know, I think if you look at the incredible complexity of this report, the word complexity showed up more than any other word in the presentations that were made by the authors. And how you affect all those levels that we're talking about, down to the teacher in the classroom. The kinds of questions that Rajiv was raising earlier, that to me is the ultimate challenge. And I understand how the report addresses them, what the building of partnerships is. It's a top-down approach. Top-down approaches matched with bottom-up approaches make a lot of sense. But I, as the hopeful skeptic, wonder what you think about how it is that you go from multiple recommendations, a complexity that is appropriate given the scope of the issue, a brilliant paradigm shifting report, to what happens in the classroom.
So if I could just briefly make a comment. This issue of agency and the role of schooling in developing children's sense of agency. There's a new book coming out by Larry Nucci at Berkeley on moral development and education and issues of social justice. And I have the great opportunity to read it because I've written an introduction for it. But one of the points that he makes is illustrating how in very micro level ways in interactions with classrooms, inside classrooms and school culture, we're able to support children in a sense of agency. And he talks, for example, about discipline policies, very negative punitive discipline policies in schools, which are highly pervasive in schools, you know, serving children of color and children living in poverty. That there are practices that go on, pedagogical practices that go on routinely in schools that diminish children's sense of agency, and yet the desire for agency is inbred in us as a species. So there are multiple layers, it seems to me, of trying to bring this work at scale, some of which are actually small enough to make a difference and are tractable and meaningful to teachers. And the word civics may not even be in the discussion at all, but that kind of shift can have an important contribution. And finally, that we are in a moment, there are so many reports out around the importance of civic knowledge and education that I think we're at a pivotal moment. And that's one of the reasons in one of our next webinars, we want to try to begin to have some conversations with all of these multiple organizations at multiple levels who are really pushing this idea. And so I think we have an opportunity at this point to bring this to bear in ways that we may not have had a few years ago.
David, let me jump in on that. David, can I give you a couple comments?
Yes, I was just going to say we have 4 minutes according to the calendar.
I'll keep
so
it to
you and Kathleen,
keep it to one,
brief, as they say in radio shows.
In 1986, corporate America came together with educators, academia, teachers unions, and researchers and policymakers to create something called the Council on Competitiveness, which became one of the major places for cross-sectoral work to ensure that all the pieces were put in place for the STEM revolution. That included professional development, the research base that was necessary, the way in which corporate America needed to rethink itself, and so on. There have been a few of us, including us at the Institute of Citizens and Scholars, who've been thinking that it's now time for a Council on Civic Strength that has a similar model and helps to create some of the infrastructure behind this movement in the same way that it happened in the mid-'80s with STEM. So you do need to create an infrastructure, David, and we're in the process of doing that and more than willing to follow up with anyone about what we're intending to do.
Great. Kathleen?
Yeah, I interviewed over 100 women who are university college presidents. They had run for and gotten elected office. They were corporate executives for a book called Beyond the Double Bind: Women in Leadership. And when I asked them what got them into their track that led them to that high level of accomplishment, the number who said student government at the elementary or secondary level was astonishingly high. These were women of very different backgrounds, but there was a common thread. What is it about student government that was empowering for them? It gave them the capacity to interact with people in authority in ways in which their agency was honored, in which they thought they could create change. And obviously for them, they must have at some point, because they went back and recalled that from their past as a pivotal moment. We don't have to only think large scale, we can think small scale. And I think there's some research back there that Peter did at one point that suggests that student government does play an important role in the civics education process.
Let me end this part of the conversation on a positive note. Escuela Nueva is a program that started in Colombia, has become worldwide, has existed since the 1970s, and is centered on student democracy. Student democracy not at high schools, not in middle schools, but in elementary schools. I visited those schools and there were kindergartners who were telling me why it is that they voted for somebody who was going to be the president of the organization. And they have real power. This is not a joke group. So I recommend to people that they learn about Escuela Nueva. You can start by reading my New York Times piece on the subject. It's the kind of model that can spread and in a simple and powerful way. So it's time to turn to the audience for questions to the panelists. And I leave it to Greg to read those questions.
And
Well,
if
thank
I
you,
could
Dave.
just
Go ahead,
add, we're also encouraging other members of our panelists and author chapters who are in the queue here to step in and respond to questions that you hear, but briefly.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we have several questions that are lined up. But the first one, and maybe to broaden it to some of the panelists, but a question of, what are some of the low-hanging fruits for taking up this work? So yes, it's a very complex problem space, but what are some things that schools could do? They could take this report and implement. So maybe, I know Diana Hess might be a good person, Joe, Carol, Naila. What are some thoughts on, what are some things that schools could immediately take from this report?
Well, I'll give it a whack. I'm not going to use the word complex, but instead I'm going to suggest that in enhancing professional development is really critical. And I think there's lots of high quality professional development that's already going on in the United States, but not at scale. And so I think we really need to focus on providing more opportunities for more teachers to learn the skills they need to teach in this kind of way.
I would also add, though, too, is that sometimes we don't sufficiently acknowledge the power of individual school communities, that there are a number of schools that are organized in such ways that they do exactly what you're talking about, Diana, without depending, for example, on the district to do that work. And that there are also interesting models that are going on in districts right now. For example, I know Chicago Public Schools, for example, their social studies division have developed some interesting curricula along these lines. And part of what we're going to try to do in the project in terms of producing some smaller kind of tractable reports where we can cite examples of people who are actually doing this work. And I think that's important to recognize. There are educators, there are schools that are actively engaged in this work right now. And our ability to highlight them, get them in conversation, with one another, I think is another starting point in terms of low-hanging fruit.
Great. How about any of the other panelists? And I can see all the panelists, so either jump in or raise your hand, and I'll be sure to call on you.
Hi, Greg. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. I just wanted to add that I was one of the authors on the history paper, and one of our findings there was that along with these more rigorous civic educational programs, curricula, teacher training, it's important to keep in mind integration as a core aspect of promoting core civic ideals in a democracy. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
Great, thank you, Zoe. So the flip side of this is, what do you see as some of the big obstacles for taking up this work? And I know some of you on our committee and our panelists have worked closely with those implementing civic education in the field. So again, I don't know if Raj or anyone from the context panel, Beth, Ruben, if you have any thoughts on, what are some of the obstacles that you anticipate in undertaking this work? Or any of the panelists, if you want to jump in.
I'll say a couple of things which may just echo what I said earlier, but I do think this tension with how much of this is about specific tools, say curriculum, even standards and so on, and how much of this is about culture and changing fundamentally the way in which you think and approach an institution and its responsibilities and how it interacts, how the adults interacts with the students, how the students interact with each other and so on. Both of those have challenges, right? And I would argue that in the end, you really do need to think about the culture issues. And I think it goes back to the professional development that Diana was talking about and so on.
Okay, Greg, this is James Banks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I really think one of the critical issues for implementing these ideas is teacher training and teacher development. Because I think teachers are very uncomfortable, for example, often discussing police killings of Black people and race and gender related issues. So I think teacher training has to be a really critical component of this implementation.
I also think a big challenge, and Diana may want to weigh in here because I know she's done work in this area, and that is I can anticipate at local school levels and district levels that there will be communities of parents who perceive what we're talking about as being very much in tension with their own sets of beliefs, and who will be very vocal in resisting it. And so just as we had approached in the report, the importance of children learning how to engage in civic discourse and reason about difference, that the same holds true for school communities to learn how do you engage, for example, as teachers and administrators with parents who say, this is simply not what I want for my children.
Well, also there has to be some kind of involvement with parents and forming of parents. Because when I taught in Chicago, for example, when I implemented issues of diversity, we had to involve the parents to let them know what we were trying to do and what would be coming so that they would be part of the change and part of the support.
It's almost as though the kinds of discourse that we're talking about that we want children to learn, engage in, that adults at all levels of this process need to also learn how to engage with one another in the same way.
Beth, you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yeah, just I think building on what Jim and Carol are saying, when we open up authentic opportunities for kids to develop and express agency, we have to be prepared for what we're going to get. It's not necessarily true that, that when kids exercise agency or use their voices that we're going to be comfortable with what they're saying and what they're expressing, and or maybe we are, but teachers or other community members or administrators. So I think that the adults who are involved in these kinds of initiatives, should need to be cognizant that opening up and empowering kids will challenge us as well. In my mind, that's all to the good, but it's an aspect of this.
I think that's very important, the point that Beth is making, because we may not anticipate all of the responses that kids may make and that will challenge us as well. Well, for example, I taught an ethnic studies course for years, and sometimes some of my male white students would be very uncomfortable with things that they would want to meet with me after class to talk about. And so that often I had to encourage them to express their opinion in an open forum.
And from some of the work I've done with schools on youth participatory action research, kids' findings are, sometimes quite challenging for the school structures and adults in the setting. And sometimes their findings aren't welcome. So, I think that's a sign that we're doing it right if people are, if kids are coming to, conclusions that are challenging, but, definitely part of this work.
So this is a great conversation. I see lots of questions lined up. So Greg, what's next in the queue?
Sure. So there was a question about potentially missing areas or missed connections. Maybe this is for Naila and for Carol. But how does this work relate to older research on interpersonal contact, I assume, the work of Alport. And there was another question about connecting to the broad literature on social emotional learning.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this is part of what is so wonderful, I think, about situating this analysis in this way, is that it really does connect up across disciplinary fields, many aspects of what we know from foundational research. So certainly the research on social emotional learning would suggest both that you need a classroom that provides a safe space for these kinds of conversations, a safe space socially, a safe space emotionally, that would then facilitate learning. It also would suggest that these issues around how you learn to communicate in ways that attend to the needs of others, manage your own emotional needs, that all of those things would be part and parcel of what you would want a curriculum to accomplish. And, for sure, like this paper is already kind of massive and very expansive in the literatures that it cites. And certainly, the literature on social contact, the early work on intergroup conflict and intergroup connection would be really relevant. We don't cite it in the paper, but certainly those connections are there to be made.
Okay. Another question from Mary Brayback. Please tell us more about what the NAEd will do regarding identifying what works. So transitioning into implementing this work, and will we look at programs, she lists just community-facing history and character education, but talking about how do we make sure this work gets undertaken by schools. So Carol, did you want to, Carol or Joe or Diana?
Well, I would say that because of the scope of what we are proposing here, we certainly don't anticipate that this is something that National Academy of Education is going to somehow make happen, but rather what we plan to do moving forward is to try to develop close collaborations and working relationships with organizations and key stakeholders who already have an imprint in doing this work. And in so doing, we would anticipate the opportunities to certainly gather information and examples of this. The challenge, I think, is some of the projects, for example, that you have mentioned, while doing really important and consequential work, specifically in civics classes, as you might think about it. Part of our challenge is we want to see what it means to take up these issues across the curriculum. And part of our efforts in doing that will be trying to connect particularly with practice-based disciplinary organizations.
Great. We also have a group of questions around assessment. And I know that Raj, you had started talking about the need as an educator to have things to assess this work and to gauge where students are at. Also familiar with other work happening around developing these assessments. So maybe if Raj or Joe or Diana, if you could talk about some of the work on assessment that's being done in civic education, and in particular around civic reasoning and discourse, or what might need to be done. And Carol, I know also you've worked a lot in assessment.
So Greg, I'll jump in for a sec. I very much resonated with Raj's comment about the need for assessment. And I think that we have some corners of that space that are handled much better than others. And perhaps not surprisingly, we focus heavily on knowledge. And that really only takes us so far. You know, I had the opportunity to work with Diana when she was at Spencer around an initiative to try to help fund the development of sort of very creative assessments that tried to speak to some of these dynamics. They're really hard to create, which is not to say that we can't do them, but they are hard to create, they're hard to implement. And I think that Raj is right. At the same time, we have to do it. I guess I'd want to highlight two other quick points. One is that it's very important to focus not just on assessing outcomes, but also on assessing the availability of learning opportunities, and therefore to be holding schools and districts, the state, in a certain sense, whether it's holding them accountable or whether it's just making sure that we have indicators on to what degree, for example, with respect to some of the practices we think are important, to what degree are we providing those practices to kids, and to what degree are we providing them to kids equitably. So I think there's a lot of ways in which assessment can focus on learning opportunities that can really help. Carol mentioned Chicago. We've been doing a lot of work with Chicago, and they've been real leaders in this, in really focusing on not just outcomes for kids, but on whether or not the civic learning opportunities, which, as Carol says, can show up across the curriculum, are reaching all kids and are reaching all kids equitably.
I'd like to add one other dimension to this work. So I've been serving on the NAEP development panel for reading in 2025. And part of the thrust of the work that that group has been doing has been to add survey items to the NAEP assessment that deal with questions about kids' perceptions of belonging, their issues around motivation. There are also assessments around things like growth mindset. There are assessments of epistemology that exist but are not typically used at any scale, both by schools or districts. And so because we tried to emphasize in this report these underlying sort of dispositions that are required, we think, as foundational for the kind of civic reasoning and discourse that we've described, also addressing, documenting, encouraging the uptake of measures that in fact do exist that could give us some insights along that. And that's why I also indicated that one of the other groups that we want to try to establish some collaborations with are in the assessment community, where there's a whole host of people, ETS and the like, who are actually thinking about these issues.
Great. We have a few minutes left. So I'm going to read another question, but if there's anyone on the steering committee, the panelists or the authors that want to jump in, please raise your hand and I'll be sure to get your input as well. But one question, I think it's, and we've talked about this in our steering committee meetings, and people sharing about, their own students or their own kids, is how do we keep them from getting burned out from the activist work that they do? So the question is, particularly to climate change, we see that there's intense levels of activism from youth. Both the responsiveness of policymakers appears lackluster. How do we continue to make sure that youths and students continue to exercise their voice and their activism without getting burned out and ultimately losing faith in their democratic agency? I'm looking at, I was actually just going to call Sarah before she jumped in.
I think that, the whole notion of starting this work with very young children and having it be ingrained in their being that they are civic actors and that they are responsible for upholding their democracy is an antidote to burnout, because a lot of times civic action is to a, kind of a one-time thing, to a particular thing that happens. And it's not kind of inculcated in people in the way that we're thinking about in this report. So I think burnout is, we all get burned out in varied ways, but if kids are from their soul civic actors from the beginning, then I think it makes a difference. And the final thing I want to say is that I think there are important models of how to do this, and there are important models of people working with teachers, and that those are things that as we go on, we'll want to publicize, I guess, and provide as resources for people who want to make change.
Great. Kathleen, did you have wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to comment. Sometimes I think we forget that the action that is most likely to have effect is going to be local. Students who are concerned about climate change should make sure there's no plastic in their cafeteria and minimize consumption of meat.
Great. Anyone else?
I just want to respond to this notion of a burnout. I think that we need to help kids understand that issues are cyclic, that they come and go, that you take, I know in my own activities, there are times when you take a break and that you don't have to go 100% all the time for every issue, but you take a break and other issues will surface. So it's cyclic. You don't have to just continue to burn yourself out.
But it's
if you're teaching kids about democracy, one of the things that they need to learn is compromise. Another is you lose sometimes.
Right.
Very difficult lesson. And keeping attention to the long run requires a kind of energy that ought to be applauded for its specialness and its rareness.
But this is also where teaching full, robust history becomes really important, because history provides this lesson of time and cycles, etc. And finally, that the work I think that we're trying to socialize children and supporting children is not simply individual, but about developing social networks and social relationships. And we need to mirror that in the context of the work of schooling, the work of schools, teachers, families, community organizations as partners in joint work of creating just and equitable opportunities for all.
That seems to be a good note to end on. We've come to the end of our time. It is 2 o'clock. I wanted to thank all of our panelists today and to David for moderating the second part of the series. We also have an ability to reach us at the National Academy of Education. If you are interested in the work that we're doing or have some ideas about carrying this work forward, you could reach us at naeducation.org. And all of our contact information is on the website, in addition to this report, the executive summary, and there will also be a video of today. And it's great to end on the note of democracy as a project, and that students need to be engaged in the long run in the maintenance of that important project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.